The can opener made a sound like a promise being broken. December 23, 1944. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, in the frozen hell that would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hartmann of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division had just captured his first American prisoner, a scared kid from the 106th Infantry Division who couldn't have been older than 19. Standard procedure: search for weapons, intelligence, anything useful. But when Hartmann opened the American's pack and found the rations, his hand stopped moving. It wasn't possible. The American private, a mere enlisted man, a nobody in the military hierarchy, was carrying more food than Hartmann had seen in one place in 6 months. Canned meat that actually smelled like meat. Crackers that didn't crumble to dust. Chocolate bars. Real chocolate, not the sawdust and synthetic substitute the Wehrmacht had been issuing since 1943. Cigarettes. Instant coffee. Sugar packets. Fruit bars. Even toilet paper, luxury beyond imagination. Hartmann looked at his own ration in his pocket, a piece of black bread that was mostly sawdust, a thin slice of ersatz sausage made from God knows what, a packet of artificial honey that tasted like sweetened motor oil. The American prisoner, misreading Hartmann's stillness for anger, started babbling in English, clearly begging for his life. But Hartmann wasn't listening. He was staring at a can labeled ham and eggs, trying to remember the last time he'd seen actual ham, actual eggs. Trying to process what it meant that American privates ate better than German generals. Trying not to think the thought that was forming like ice in his mind: if this is what they feed their lowest soldiers, what chance do we have? He looked up at the American, this boy who had surrendered without firing a shot, who was terrified and probably homesick and definitely about to spend Christmas as a prisoner of war. And for the first time in 5 years of war, Wilhelm Hartmann felt not hatred or contempt for his enemy, but envy so pure it made him dizzy. The American was defeated, captured, probably heading to a POW camp where he'd eat potato soup and black bread for months or years. And yet, until 20 minutes ago, this scared boy had been eating better than Hartmann's own company commander. How can you fight an enemy who eats better than you live? Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe so more people discover these untold truths. The story of how American rations broke German morale is one of the war's least told but most devastating psychological victories. It wasn't planned as propaganda. It wasn't designed as a weapon. It was simply the collision of two different worlds, one of abundance, one of scarcity, meeting on the battlefield in the most mundane yet profound way, through food. By 1944, the average German soldier was surviving on approximately 2,000 calories per day when supplies arrived, which was increasingly rare. The official ration, when it could be delivered, consisted of 750 grams of bread, though by late war, bread meant a mixture of rye, sawdust, and potato starch, 150 grams of meat or sausage, often horse meat or mysterious pressed substances, 45 grams of fat or margarine, 120 grams of vegetables, usually preserved cabbage or turnips. An ersatz coffee made from roasted barley or acorns. That was the theory. The reality was often far worse. Hans Müller, a Wehrmacht private who fought on the Western Front, wrote in his diary in September 1944. Today's ration: half a loaf of bread that crumbled when I touched it, a tin of meat dated 1942 that smelled like death, and coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. Otto joked that we should surrender just for the food. Nobody laughed because nobody was sure he was joking. Meanwhile, the American K-ration, designed as an emergency field ration for paratroopers and considered by U.S. troops to be barely adequate, contained approximately 3,000 calories spread across 3 meals. Breakfast included a 4-ounce can of chopped ham and eggs or veal loaf, biscuits, a dried fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. Lunch provided a can of processed cheese or pâté, more biscuits, candy, gum, and beverages. Dinner offered canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, and more cigarettes. This was what Americans complained about. This was what they considered hardship eating. The C-ration was even more substantial: canned meat dishes like beef stew, chicken and vegetables, or spaghetti, crackers, candy, powdered drinks, and accessories like can openers, toilet paper, and matches. The 10-in-1 ration, designed to feed 10 men for one day, included canned bacon, butter, jam, and even canned pudding. American soldiers griped about the monotony, made jokes about the mystery meat, traded furiously to avoid eating the same thing twice. They had no idea they were carrying psychological weapons more devastating than their rifles. The first reports of German soldiers' reactions to captured American rations began filtering through intelligence channels in late 1943, after the invasion of Italy. A captured German lieutenant, interrogated about morale issues, mentioned almost in passing, "The men were disturbed by American rations. They couldn't understand how you could transport such plenty across an ocean while we couldn't feed ourselves from our own land." But it was in 1944, as American forces pushed into France and toward Germany, that the full impact became clear. German soldiers who captured American supplies or prisoners often experienced what military psychologists would later term abundance shock. The gap between what they had been told about American weakness and what they saw in American supplies created a cognitive dissonance that shattered morale more effectively than any propaganda could have. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wagner wrote to his wife in November 1944, "Liebling, I must tell you something that haunts me. We captured American supplies yesterday. They're regular soldiers, not officers, just common soldiers, carry chocolate that our children haven't seen in years. They have meat in cans that actually tastes like meat. They have coffee, real coffee, while we drink bitter water pretending it's coffee. They complain about their rations," Ernst told me. "They complain about food that would be a feast for us. How can we defeat an enemy who considers a feast to be hardship?" The psychological impact was multiplied by the backstory each ration represented. Every American can of food had traveled thousands of miles across submarine-infested oceans, been loaded onto trains, trucks, jeeps, carried to the front lines, and distributed to individual soldiers. The logistics chain required to put a chocolate bar in a private's pocket in the Ardennes was staggering. And the Americans did it millions of times over, every day, without apparent strain. German logistics, meanwhile, was collapsing. Railways bombed to rubble. Horse-drawn wagons replacing trucks that had no fuel. Supply lines stretching from an increasingly isolated Germany to fronts in France, Italy, Russia. The Wehrmacht was often reduced to living off the land, which meant taking food from already starving civilian populations, creating resentment and resistance that further complicated their situation. Colonel Klaus Zimmermann, a Wehrmacht logistics officer captured in France, told his interrogators, "You Americans don't understand what you've done. Your abundance is visible in every tin can, every candy bar, every cigarette. Our soldiers see it and think, if they can waste resources like this on food, what else do they have? The ration in a GI's pocket tells them more about American industrial might than any intelligence report could." The disparity created surreal moments on the battlefield. During the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, a German patrol ambushed an American supply convoy. Instead of ammunition or weapons, they found themselves in possession of hundreds of cases of rations. The German soldiers, exhausted and starving after weeks of combat, fell upon the food with desperate hunger. One survivor recalled, "We forgot about the war. We forgot about security. We just ate canned peaches, can you imagine? We hadn't seen fruit in 2 years. Men were crying as they ate chocolate. Proper chocolate, not the synthetic garbage we'd been getting. Some of the men made themselves sick eating too much too fast. And all I could think was, this is what they eat every day. Every day." The American plenty seemed almost supernatural to German soldiers raised on years of rationing, ersatz substitutes, and propaganda about soft, weak Americans. How could the decadent Americans, who supposedly cared only for comfort and luxury, be better at the harsh logistics of war than the disciplined, Spartanish Germans? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Letters home from German soldiers increasingly mentioned American rations, often in ways that revealed deep demoralization. A collection of correspondence captured by American forces in January 1945 included dozens of references to food. "The Americans eat like peacetime while we starve in war," wrote one soldier. Another noted, I no longer believe we can win. A nation that can feed its army so well while fighting across the world has resources we cannot match. A third wrote simply, They are not suffering. We are suffering. That tells you everything about how this will end. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. Hit like and subscribe. The German High Command was aware of the problem. A secret report from the Wehrmacht's Morale Division in December 1944 noted, Enemy rations have become a significant factor in the degradation of troop morale. Soldiers who encounter American supplies experience what can only be described as despair. Recommend immediate propaganda countermeasures. The propaganda machine tried. They spread stories that American rations were poisoned, that the abundance was fake, just for show, that American soldiers were actually starving but given prop food for captured Germans to find. They claimed the rations contained drugs that made American soldiers cowardly, that the chocolate was synthetic, that the meat was made from rats. But the soldiers who had tasted the American food knew better. You can't fake the taste of real chocolate when you've been eating sawdust bars for 2 years. Some German officers tried to use the American rations as motivation, arguing that such luxury made Americans soft, unprepared for real hardship. Hauptmann Erich Richter told his men, Yes, they eat well, but this makes them weak. When the supplies stop, they will crumble. We who have learned to fight on nothing will prevail. But his words rang hollow when, during the Ardennes offensive, German forces repeatedly ran out of fuel and food while American units, despite being surprised and surrounded, never seemed to run out of anything. The rations told a story that no amount of propaganda could counter. America was rich beyond German imagination, and it could project that wealth across oceans and continents with casual efficiency. Every candy bar was proof of American industrial might. Every can of meat was evidence of American agricultural abundance. Every stick of gum was a small, chewable piece of evidence that Germany had already lost. Private Kurt Schneider, captured in March 1945, told his American captors, When I saw your rations, I knew the war was over. My uncle fought in the last war. He told me that armies march on their stomachs. Your armies march on full stomachs. Ours march on empty ones. You cannot win a war with empty stomachs, no matter how brave you are. The impact went beyond individual soldiers. When German civilians encountered American rations, either through conquest or black market trading, the effect was equally devastating. Frau Helena Braun, whose son was in the Wehrmacht, wrote in her diary after trading family heirlooms for American rations, The chocolate is real. The coffee is real. The meat is real. Everything we've been told is a lie. If American soldiers eat like this, what must American civilians eat? We have been fighting giants while being told they were dwarfs. The American military was largely unaware of the psychological impact their rations were having. To them, K rations and C rations were just food, often bad food, certainly monotonous food. GIs complained constantly about the repetitiveness, made endless jokes about the mystery meat, traded obsessively to avoid eating ham and eggs for the 5th day straight. They had no idea that their complaints about abundance were being overheard by enemies who would have wept with joy to have such problems. Lieutenant Robert Jackson from Ohio wrote home, The food here is terrible. Same canned meat every day. The locals look at us like we're crazy when we complain, but they don't understand. You can only eat so much canned ham before you want to scream. He had no idea that German soldiers reading captured mail like his experienced a rage so profound it bordered on despair. Complaining about too much ham to men who hadn't seen meat in months was like complaining about too much water to someone dying of thirst. The ration disparity created unexpected problems for German intelligence. When interrogating American prisoners, German officers often didn't believe their answers about supplies and logistics. The numbers seemed impossible. An American division consuming 30 tons of supplies per day? Individual soldiers carrying 3 days of rations that weighed more than a German soldier's weekly food allocation? Surely this was misinformation, propaganda, lies to demoralize German forces. But it wasn't. It was just Tuesday in the American Army. Major Heinrich Hoffmann, interrogating captured American supply officers, wrote in his report, The prisoner claims their standard daily ration allocation is 4,700 calories per man in combat zones. This is clearly false propaganda, as such allocation would be impossible to maintain. Recommend disregarding all supply intelligence from American prisoners as unreliable. He was wrong. The Americans were telling the truth. The impossible was their normal. The German soldiers' ration, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate. By early 1945, even the theoretical 2,000 calories were a fantasy. Units were receiving perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 calories when supplies arrived at all. The bread was now more sawdust than grain. The meat was often just flavored paste. Coffee had disappeared entirely, replaced by coffee substitute. Roasted grain that had already been used once for ersatz coffee, dried, and reused. Even salt became scarce. Gefreiter Johann Zimmermann wrote one of the most heartbreaking letters of the war in February 1945. I dreamed of Mother's kitchen last night. I could smell bread, real bread, not this compressed dust we eat. I woke up crying. Hans laughed at me until he realized he was crying too. We're all so hungry. Yesterday we captured American supplies. I ate until I was sick. Real food. Meat that tasted like meat. Chocolate. Coffee with sugar. Sugar. For an hour, I felt human again. Then I remembered we have to go back to our rations tomorrow, and I understood that we've already lost this war. You can't fight when you're always hungry. You can't win when your enemy's garbage is better than your feast. The American production statistics were indeed staggering. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 500 million cans of meat, 400 million pounds of dehydrated vegetables, 300 million pounds of coffee, and 1 billion chocolate bars for military consumption. The logistics network delivered approximately 7 pounds of supplies per soldier per day to European theaters. 7 pounds? Every day. To millions of soldiers. Across an ocean. During a war. German logistics officers, when they learned these numbers after the war, simply couldn't process them. General Franz Halder, reviewing American supply documents, said, "We thought in terms of trains and divisions. They thought in terms of ships and armies. We counted bullets. They counted tons. We rationed grams. They shipped pounds. It wasn't the same war." The rations became a form of passive psychological warfare. American units learned that leaving behind open but partially eaten rations had a demoralizing effect on German forces who found them. The sight of Americans wasting food that German soldiers would kill for was devastating. It spoke to a casual abundance that made German privation seem not noble but pointless. Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston recalled, "We figured out that leaving half-eaten cans of food around bothered the Krauts more than empty ones. Empty means you needed it. Half-eaten means you had so much you couldn't even finish it. We'd deliberately leave stuff behind, open cans with food still in them, chocolate with one bite taken, full packs of cigarettes with one missing. It was psychological warfare with garbage." The impact on German morale was measurable. Desertion rates increased significantly in units that had encountered American supplies. Surrender rates were higher among German forces that had captured and consumed American rations. The will to fight, that ineffable quality that keeps soldiers going despite impossible odds, eroded with every can of American Spam, every bar of Hershey's chocolate, every pack of Lucky Strikes. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 are filled with references to food, specifically American food. "The men talk constantly about American rations," noted one report. "They trade rumors about what the Americans eat. They speculate about American supplies. This obsession with enemy food indicates a dangerous decline in fighting spirit." Another report was more blunt. "The troops no longer believe victory is possible. They cite American rations as evidence that we face an enemy with unlimited resources. Recommend immediate increase in ration quality and quantity." The recommendation was marked "impossible" in red ink. The German military tried various strategies to counter the demoralizing effect of American rations. They issued orders forbidding soldiers from consuming captured American supplies, claiming they were poisoned or drugged. When this failed, starving soldiers will risk poisoning for real food. They tried to contextualize the disparity. American abundance, they argued, was proof of American materialism and spiritual poverty. Germans might have less food, but they had more honor, more culture, more racial purity. It was a hard sell to men whose stomachs were eating themselves from hunger. Some German units tried to use captured American rations as rewards, parceling them out to boost morale. But this backfired. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity became even starker when a single American ration was divided among an entire squad as a special treat. Instead of boosting morale, it reminded every soldier of what the enemy had and they didn't. The ration disparity created moments of dark comedy. A German propaganda broadcast in January 1945 attempted to demoralize American forces by describing the wonderful Christmas dinner German soldiers had enjoyed: roast goose, potatoes, vegetables, cake. American intelligence intercepted German communications from the same day describing the actual Christmas meal: thin soup, black bread, and if lucky, a slice of blood sausage. The Americans broadcast both versions back to German lines, asking which was true. The propaganda broadcast stopped. Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again. But perhaps the most telling moment came during the German surrender negotiations. When German officers sat down with American counterparts to discuss terms, they were served a standard American field lunch, nothing special, just regular rations prepared by regular army cooks. The German officers ate in silence, some with tears in their eyes. One later recalled, "We knew the war was over. We were there to negotiate surrender. But eating that simple American meal, better than anything German soldiers had seen in years, that was when I truly understood the magnitude of our defeat. They could feed their enemies better than we could feed our own men." The aftermath of the war revealed the full scope of the disparity. American forces distributed their surplus rations to starving German civilians and prisoners. Children who had been raised on ersatz everything tasted chocolate for the first time. Former Wehrmacht soldiers, now prisoners, gained weight in captivity eating regular American rations. The same food American soldiers complained about became salvation for defeated Germans. Hans Müller, the Wehrmacht private whose diary we quoted earlier, survived the war and eventually emigrated to America. In a 1985 interview he recalled, "The first time I saw American rations, I thought it was a trick, propaganda, fake somehow. Real chocolate? Actual coffee? Meat that looked and tasted like meat? Impossible. But it was real. And that's when I knew, really knew, not just feared but knew, that we would lose. You cannot defeat an enemy who can casually feed its soldiers better than you can feed your officers on their birthday. The chocolate bar in that American's pocket was worth more than all our propaganda, all our ideology, all our supposed racial superiority. It was proof that we had already lost." The story of American rations and German morale is more than just a footnote in military history. It's a reminder that wars are not won only on battlefields but in factories, farms, and supply chains. Every can of Spam that crossed the Atlantic was a small victory. Every chocolate bar in a GI's pocket was a tiny piece of evidence that American industrial democracy could outproduce German totalitarianism. Every K-ration, however much GIs complained about them, was proof that free societies could mobilize resources in ways that authoritarian regimes, for all their discipline and control, could not match. The German soldiers who lost faith when they saw American rations weren't weak or cowardly. They were rational human beings who could read the writing on the wall, or in this case, the writing on the can. When your enemy's emergency ration is better than your feast, when their privates eat better than your generals, when they can transport abundance across oceans while you can't feed armies from your own land, the conclusion is inevitable. The war is over. You just haven't admitted it yet. In the end, the American rations were more than food. They were messages, millions of small, edible messages that all said the same thing: America had more. More food, more fuel, more factories, more of everything. And in a total war, a war of production and logistics as much as strategy and tactics, more was everything. The German soldiers who opened American rations and felt their faith in victory die weren't wrong. They were seeing the future, one can at a time. There's a memorial now at the site of one of the last battles of the European War, where desperate German forces made a final stand against advancing American armies. Among the artifacts in the small museum is a can, an unopened can of American ration beef stew, found in the pocket of a dead German soldier. He had taken it from captured American supplies and kept it, apparently unable to bring himself to eat it, carrying it like a talisman or a curse until the end. The museum label notes, simply, German soldier's possession, April 1945. But every visitor who knows the story understands what that can really represents. The moment when a soldier looked at his enemy's food and saw his own defeat. The great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz wrote that war is politics by other means. But for the German soldiers who encountered American rations in the final years of World War II, war was logistics by other means. And in that war, the war of supply chains and production lines, of farms and factories, of calories and quantities, they learned a bitter truth: you cannot win a war on an empty stomach against an enemy whose greatest complaint is monotony of plenty. The American rations won no medals, earned no glory, made no headlines. But in their quiet way, they fought a war within the war, a psychological campaign that required no propaganda, no leaflets, no broadcasts. Just chocolate bars and canned meat, cigarettes and instant coffee, small everyday items that carried within them the entire weight of American industrial might and the promise of inevitable victory. Wars are not only won with bullets, but with bread. And in this war, America had more bread than Germany had bullets. The German soldiers who saw American rations and lost faith in victory weren't just hungry. They were witnesses to a truth too profound for propaganda to counter: that America could wage war with casual abundance while Germany struggled to survive. In every can, every wrapper, every chocolate bar, they saw the future. And the future tasted like defeat. The echo of those opened cans still resonates through history, the sound of abundance meeting scarcity, of industrial democracy defeating fascist austerity, of simple human needs revealing profound military truths. The German soldiers who lost faith when they saw American rations larger than Wehrmacht officers' lunches weren't just losing a war. They were discovering that they had been fighting the wrong war all along, trying to win with ideology and discipline against an enemy that had already won with chocolate and spam. In the ruins of the Third Reich, among the destroyed cities and broken armies, amid the collapse of everything they had been told to believe, German soldiers remembered American rations. Not the battles, not the strategies, not the weapons, but the food. The simple, abundant, impossibly rich food that told them everything they needed to know about how the war would end. They had thought they were fighting for living space, for resources, for survival. And they learned, one open can at a time, that their enemies already had more resources than they could even imagine. The last word belongs to Wilhelm Hartmann, the Unteroffizier we met at the beginning, who captured that American private in the Ardennes. He survived the war, spent 2 years in American captivity eating regular American rations, gaining 30 pounds in the process. Interviewed decades later, he said, "That moment when I opened the American's pack and saw his rations, that was when the war ended for me. Not when I surrendered, not when Hitler died, not when the papers were signed. But right then, holding food I couldn't even dream of while fighting for a cause that couldn't feed its soldiers. The American boy I captured was more afraid than I was. But he had chocolate in his pocket, and I had sawdust bread. He had already won. He just didn't know it yet." The aftertaste of war isn't always blood and gunpowder. Sometimes it's chocolate and instant coffee, spam and cigarettes. Sometimes victory tastes like a candy bar, and defeat tastes like sawdust. Sometimes the biggest battles are fought not with weapons but with rations, and the winner is whoever can feed their soldiers not just enough to survive, but enough to complain about the variety. In the end, the German soldiers who lost faith when they saw American rations understood something profound: you cannot fight tomorrow when your enemy is already living in it. And nothing said tomorrow quite like a well-fed American private complaining about having ham and eggs for breakfast again, while you're trying to make sawdust bread last another day. The war of rations was a war Germany never knew it was fighting until it had already lost. And by then, All that was left was the bitter taste of defeat and the haunting memory of American abundance, wrapped in olive drab and labeled U.S. Army Field Ration.